I think we're resolving the technical issues, and we're going to go ahead with our meeting. The next item on the agenda, therefore, is to a review of the public comment period and the draft CTV policy. Jennifer.
So in your packet, you have a table, that's a summary of the comments that we received during the public comment period. We received, I think it was 9 or 10 comments. They covered.
I can't hear Jen, but I can see she's talking.
Okay, let me get.
Jen, why don't you have a seat up here?
Yeah. Okay.
Up here.
All right.
They're facilitating, actually.
All right, we'll try again. Cindy, can you hear me?
Yes, thank you so much.
I can hear you. And I can hear you.
Okay,
this is great. Great. So we received 9 or 10 comments during the public comment period. There were a few key themes. I think Dr. Snyder summarized his, were very detailed, and clearly they put a lot of analysis into the comments that they submitted. We also received lengthy comments from Hampton Roads Transit in Fairfax County, all in a fairly similar vein. On the other end of the spectrum, we received comments from the city of Lynchburg and from Greater Lynchburg Transit that were concerned about the impacts of the transition year of the formula, because they were a system that did well under the proposed recommendation following the transition year, but they were actually hurt by the transition year. So that they had submitted comments as well. And Loudoun County also submitted comments that were fairly similar to PRTC's in terms of concerns about negative impacts on the long-haul commuter service around the state. So in looking at the comments and putting together a recommendation to try to address what came in with the public comments, there were some comments that are, policy in nature that need to be addressed in the policy, and then there were a few other things that were more technical in nature and should go in the guidance. So we did modify. You want to look at the policy? We'll start with that. There are a couple of modifications to the policy.
That's the CTV resolution.
CTV resolution, yes. There was a concern in the comments, several of the comments that were received, that there are some agencies that are, from a percentage perspective, are receiving a pretty good bump in their operating under the new formula. And there was a concern that funding should not be used to offset any local contributions. It's hard for us to track and audit a maintenance of effort, but what we did include in the policy resolution is language that says for those agencies that receive an increase in state assistance as a result of the performance-based formula, that they should be investing that increased allocation into sustaining and expanding service options. So that's, not to reduce the local commitment, but to expand the service options in their service areas. And then the other change that you'll see is under, we did, and I think this goes back to Lisa's comment earlier, we did maintain the transition year, even though we had the language from the General Assembly, because that is what the recommendation coming out of this body was. So we do have the step down in the operating costs for fiscal year 20. We have operating costs at 60%, ridership at 20, and then the policy resolution talks about after that it would be at 50 and 30. So we did include language in here that supplemental assistance would be provided for fiscal year 20 to any mass transit provider that would receive a reduction in the operating assistance as a direct result of the implementation of the performance-based allocation methodology. That language is identical with what is in the legislative language. And then we went on to clarify, and this was something that we also saw in comments, but that the impact would be determined by comparing fiscal year 20 allocations under the prior formula to fiscal year 20 allocations under the new formula. So we will run fiscal year 20 two ways. We'll run it using the model we used for fiscal year 19, that same formula allocation. Then we'll run the same set of performance data using the new model, and we'll be able to show everybody a comparison. And then that would be the difference that we would make, that we would address with the hold harmless language up to $3 million.
Okay.
Now, the change in definition to address the comments that we received about the long-haul commuter service. Those types of definitions aren't outlined in the CTB policy resolution, but they are outlined in our performance-based operating allocation guidance that we put out as a draft with the public comment period as well. We've made a modification in this document under our proposed process that would change those definitions for revenue vehicle hours and revenue vehicle miles, and the language is the same in both, that for unidirectional commuter routes that are greater than 20 miles in length, that non-revenue hours, or in the case of miles, non-revenue miles, associated with their deadhead trips would be considered as revenue vehicle miles or revenue vehicle hours for the purpose of allocating operating assistance. And so that is a change in definition. The rest of the changes to the guidance document are editorial in nature. It's just cleaning up some of the language that carried over from some of the scenarios that we wanted to clean up from a guidance perspective. I do want to address Lisa's comment about the TSDAC recommendation. We did strike that this is a DRPT guidance document. You may recall that we sent out a draft of the TSDAC process summary that WSP put together. It's almost, I think it was over 200 pages by the time all of the materials that this body reviewed between September and December ended up in one place. So all of the TSDAC process, all of the deliberations, everything that was presented, including the recommendation that this body made, is all memorialized there. And so that was sent out as a draft. We haven't received, I don't think, Courtney, we received any comments back on that, but we can circulate that again for TSDAC to look at. But again, our intent would be to publish that on our webpage with the rest of the material so that that process is memorialized.
And if I may add to that as well, to clarify, what the CTB will be voting on is the policy, and that's documented in the resolution. This is a guidance document that talks about how DRPT will implement the policy. The CTB does not approve this document. This is agency implementation information. So I do want to be clear about what the CTB would actually be acting on. And again, it's the policy with the overall formula, including the transition year formula, that was recommended by TSDAC, and which has been out for public comment.
Okay. Any questions? Cindy or Kate, do you have any questions or comments?
This is Kate. Hello?
Yes, Kate, go ahead.
Yeah, this is Kate. Just to clarify, so on the CTB resolution, what was previously a recommendation from TSDAC to have a transition year, which would have allowed for a operating cost to change, instead of actually changing that formula in year 2, you're replacing that with the transition funding, correct?
No, we actually have both in there. So we left the transition year that's at 60 and 20 and have the transition assistance.
Okay, thank you.
And what I think is important to remind everybody is that we briefed the CTB on TSDAC's recommendation back in December, and so that whole 2-step formula process was outlined to the board back in December. We went back to them in January and presented it again with the understanding that the public comment period was still pending or was still open, and that there was legislation pending. And so we felt like it was important not to change that step down in the formula because it was a recommendation of TSDAC. It has been presented to the board, and so the only change is what was legislated, and that is the transition assistance.
Thank you.
Thank you. Can you share, Jen, a little more maybe about the focusing in on the definition around the crediting the deadhead miles, what the implications of that policy would be in terms of just impacts on the program, and maybe speak to that a little bit?
Sure, and I'm happy to address it too. I can say that we really didn't have enough data to provide a definitive scenario on this issue, but we attempted to do some back of the envelope calculations with some estimates of what we thought certain systems were operating in terms of these long commuter routes. We did see that for the systems that have a high degree of commuter service, such as PRTC, such as Loudoun, it would probably bump up their contribution somewhat, but not to a point necessarily where they were going to be making a lot more. As we got into this, we also looked at HRT's miles. We learned during that period, we actually thought HRT would benefit from it as well, but we learned as well that HRT was already calculating most of their deadhead miles as revenue miles. That's a process I know we've been speaking extensively about that with FTA as well. We're looking into that, about how that would change things for next year, not necessarily for FY20. But so that was the reason some of the data we didn't feel was complete enough to really present to TSDAC as a definitive scenario. During that time also, though, we were collecting the new data for FY20, and whatever we presented to you all using the old model and the old data, we already know is changing because we're in the process of collecting all the new performance data. And so, again, we just didn't feel we had something definitive enough to provide. From a policy standpoint, I think the reason that we felt this was an appropriate change to make in terms of how we treat some of the data is that these commuter routes truly are very unique across the state. And these long routes, which provide service from a exurban destination into an employment center like DC or the Pentagon, you almost have to have those kind of deadhead miles in order to operate those types of routes by definition. And so we just felt that it was appropriate to address a change just for those type of routes because they are unique, and treating those miles as deadhead miles really do penalize the systems that operate that kind of service. So that's why we felt it was appropriate to do it there, because in a sense the deadhead miles are necessary and they're part of that, a critical part of that service. So.
The follow-up question would be, so as it's written here, it looks like this would apply, as it's stated, it says only to certain routes that are 20 miles of length. And, I'm also curious, I guess, about, like, what is the trigger for, why 20 miles? If I have a route that's, has 18 miles of deadhead service, at what point do you, would I not get any value? Would I be essentially penalized and not be able to count my deadhead miles just for the lack of those final 2 miles? How do we make this? How's the decision essentially around those kind of issues?
I don't know that I would say that there was a magic way that we did look at some of the routes that, again, HRT operates and PRTC and Loudoun. 20 miles seemed like a pretty natural cutoff there. That it also just seemed like an appropriate amount to say those are very long distance routes. I know PRTC operates some routes that are also just under 20 miles as well, and so we did not feel that we should make a sort of arbitrary cutoff in order to include everything, but 20 miles just seemed like a very reasonable distance.
Yeah, but the other system that has commuter routes is PRTC here in Richmond. And their routes are, the longest one is 15, 18 miles. And those routes are all fairly compact. They only run a few routes like that. And so we were trying to find the sweet spot, I guess, that was going to capture those long haul, where deadhead's making a pretty big impact on their costs and their operations, and an impact on congestion, and separate that from something that is a little bit more local in nature, what we see here in Richmond.
Mm-hmm. So I guess the last final comment, I guess I would make a comment would be, I do think, and I should say too that, like, I don't want anything that I say to be misconstrued this is not supportive of these. Like, these are very important trips, and I understand the business behind it and so forth. But just I think some of the implications of crediting the deadhead miles as revenue miles, basically, and wondering too a little bit about other services. Because sometimes, and like I mentioned earlier in the case of HRT, we do cover a large geographic area and significantly above our peer agencies in terms of like some of these trips. And so in some cases, even with what would otherwise be considered local fixed route service, you may have significant deadhead miles that, traveling from a garage in one place to start the service, at a significant distance away. And, it seems like those kinds of trips are I think all kinds of, we could probably agree all kinds of transit is important. So, where do you, decide to credit deadhead miles for one service versus another? I think if as it is here, we're focusing just on commuter routes, then, what that seems to suggest is that we are basically taking a cost of doing business. As you mentioned, this is basically essential to even provide this service. It's a cost, and we're bringing that over into to absorb it within a performance metric. And there's a little bit of a struggle there if we take some cost of doing business and put it over here, but we don't. It just seems to open up other potential issues, I guess. But I understand specific to commuter routes why this could be done. It's just I think it does create maybe some challenges in that respect. And I know that kind of in a way it touches the whole issue of how we factor in operating costs. And the other point I'll make, I'll be brief, but because we just looked at some of the public comments and talked about the transition funding. I think sometimes we use the same words, but in my mind they get a little bit mixed up. We talk about transition assistance in terms of the funding, on one hand, the funding to support anybody who's negatively impacted. But I think TSDAC discussions, too, was about transition more from the programmatic side in terms of the weighting and the metrics. So it wasn't really transition assistance like the funding. It was just transition in the sense of transitioning the program and stepping it down from counting operating costs at 60% to 55 to 50. And I think that kind of speaks to this issue too. Why perhaps there is justification in operating costs being factored at a higher rate. That gives an opportunity to kind of build in some of those other core costs of doing business that are true across the board. But those are just some observations. So.
Other comments or questions?
No, I would just from our experience with Smart Scale and the CTB, I would advise those agencies that are going to be impacted by this to be patient and give it some time and not learn how to game the system, but learn how to work with the system. The scoring metrics are going to be there. You can really score your own projects and make sure the projects you're submitting. Some of the localities that have been in Smart Scale, you talk to some that hate it because, quite frankly, they put up projects that are not. I mean, they should know just based on the metrics they've been given, they're not going to be funded. And some of the localities are really good at putting in the right projects. Chesterfield County is a great example. Every year they leave Smart Scale smiling, and I just recommend to those to embrace what the metrics are and why they're there. The legislature is going to insist on this type of metric in order to ever come up with any more funding for transit. It's always a tough nut at the legislatures. You've been there for years asking for help with this, but I strongly recommend they embrace it and work hard and measure their own project requests before they submit them.
Yeah, I think it is important to remember that we will have opportunities to see if there's a dysfunction to this as well.
Oh, absolutely. And we've adjusted Smart Scale somewhat.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
We had to, because you're not going to be right out of the box.
Right. Any other comments? All right. Then we don't take any further action today on this. All right. So then, next step.
So what we anticipate is we would like to probably hold a another meeting of TSDAC over the summer to, at some point, to just evaluate what has come out of the 6-year plan and inform you all about that. And then discuss next steps after, or, where we go after that. I think that, I appreciate the comments that Lisa made as well about, in terms of, from VTA's standpoint as well, about being able to work together to look at new funding opportunities and potentially increasing the amount of operating funding that I think that this discussion and debate, as it unfolded in the General Assembly process, also did educate a lot of legislators about the fact that operating funding is very scarce, and operating funding is a big challenge for localities to come up with. And so I think there may be some opportunities there to try to take that message forward in the next General Assembly session, if it does seem like the right time to try to push for some additional transit funding. So, but I would, again, I think once we get a chance to have the 6-year plan approved by the CTB, we'll have the opportunity to get together and evaluate what happened and what the formula looks like going forward. And if we saw any major dysfunctions that we feel need to be addressed going forward. I appreciate Mr. Williams' comments as well about giving it a chance to kind of phase in and to see and embrace it and to see how it works. But I think, and it may take a couple of years of experience to also evaluate what happens. And as I mentioned before, really the biggest determinant of each agency's funding that they receive is our revenue collections. And so, it may fluctuate up, it may fluctuate down. We're not in a position to say yet what next year's funding. I'm optimistic and hopeful that everyone will actually get more funding next year than they did last year, regardless of how your share of the state funding may have changed, if we have higher revenue collections than we did last year. So, again, those are all things that once the 6-year plan is approved, we'll have the opportunity to look back and bring some information to you all to, look at how we think it worked.
John, just an observation too, during the General Assembly session this year, the Amazon process, I think, brought to light a lot to a lot of folks that really aren't tuned in to transit and understand it. I mean, most of our Commonwealth doesn't have transit, and it's in terms of geographic areas. I think they got a real education on the value of having a good transit system. And without it, Amazon would not be coming there. Of course, a lot of people wish they weren't, but I'm among those that are glad they are. And without the system that we got in place up there, it would have been a non-starter. And so areas like Hampton Roads and areas like Richmond that have larger transit systems, I think they clearly saw the value.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's an important point, and certainly those folks who rely on transit for getting to places of work or just to travel around town and do their daily activities, I know would be appreciative of additional support and increased services, and that will, of course, stimulate more interest in participating in transit.
Millennials are looking for it, in a car. It's really interesting.
All right. Well, with that, we will, I guess, await a date for a meeting this summer.
Yeah, we'll poll you as the date gets closer to look at potential dates.
And since we're not quite at 11 o'clock, I'll just since I moved public comment, if there is anybody who didn't have an opportunity to speak to them, wants to do so now, we could do that. But I don't see any rush to the table, so and I will just.
Oh, if I may, I just want to thank all of you as well for the hard work that you've done. And I'm also looking at the other people in the room that represent some of the transit systems that have really actively engaged in this. It's been a lot of work, and not just the operating formula, but before that we were also doing the capital formula. I mean, it's been a very, very intense year of monthly meetings with a lot of information that's been going out. And I just want to thank all of you. I know none of you get compensated for this because it's not part of your day jobs, but I really appreciate the work that you guys have put into it and the people that you've represented as well. So thank you from DRPT too.
Thanks very much. And we'll adjourn this meeting.
So y'all do.